You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. All right, everyone, we have an episode of firsts here today. Quite a few, actually. We have the first time that we have these two lovely people on the podcast with me here today. The first time we have a sibling duo, brother and sister, on the pod. First time we are talking about a book that has not released yet. And I'm guessing that this is going to be the first time you all have heard of the topic that we're talking about today, too. So we have quite a bit to talk about. Let me just give a quick intro here. We have Paul and Billie Hoard. Paul is a mental health counselor, author, associate professor of counseling psychology at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. So nothing too out of the box there. That's pretty ordinary life, right? Not too busy. Billie is a teacher, author, a self-proclaimed Anabaptist radical, has an MA in liberal arts from St. John's College, writes about gender, fairy tales, C.S. Lewis, theology, philosophy, and a little bit of everything else in between there. So, Paul and Billie, thank you so much for joining us here today on Bible Uncut and Unfiltered.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to meet both of them back last October at Theology Beer Camp in Colorado. And Billie was actually the second person that I met there and talked to. Yeah. So I asked one person for directions to make sure I was going to the right room. And then Billie handed me the beer that we were drinking for the pregame event, which was incredible. If any of you are into beer, it was the kind of beer that comes in a wine bottle, so you know it's good. It was one of those like lambic ales. So
it was really good. It was like the wild fermented. Lauren found that.
Gosh, I loved it. That pregame session that I went to, I think, what do we call it? Sacred Contamination.
Yeah,
was the event.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I will use the word, it was life-changing, I think. It was my favorite part of camp, just such an awesome experience. And no offense to whoever gave me directions, because I just don't really remember who that was or what the encounter was.
And deep,
right. Yes. So really my first interaction that I remember at beer camp clearly was with Billie. And I just remember her looking slightly overwhelmed with everything going on, but also just made me feel so welcome and had a great smile on there. So then she and Paul led it was a whole meal and talking about all this theology of disgust and Eucontamination, which we're going to be getting into. And as soon as it was over, I rushed up to Paul, handed him the business card and said, as soon as you get this book done, you're coming on the podcast. So we made good on that promise.
Here we are.
So we have you here because you have a book coming out in just a couple of weeks. In fact, it'll probably be coming out around the time this episode does. This should air on the 20th, I think. And I believe the book's coming out on the 1st of August.
Yeah, August.
Fantastic.
Again, you never
right.
I want to be careful not to give any firm deadlines, but that's the plan at the moment.
Yeah, it's a wild world of publishing.
Yeah.
So that's why we have him on here to talk about the book Eucontamination. I was just kind of curious, as I was reading through it, what was like your ideal reader for the book? Who were you hoping would be the kind of person that would read this?
Paul, go for it.
That's a good question. I don't know that as I was writing it that I had the this is who I'm trying to talk to. It was probably a little bit more of this is what's really fascinating to me. And so probably myself in perhaps a little narcissistic sort of way. I'm really fascinated by these ideas, and writing the book helped us really flesh out the ideas. So we sort of, the process of getting to this point, we had 3 articles on the topic, years of discussion before we actually got to the point of writing a whole book on it. And so the book was just a really fun place to not have to be as concise or focused. When you write an article, you kind of want to build it around one idea. And then you give the argumentation around the one idea. When we got a book, we sort of okay, here's what the book's about. But then the chapters gave us an opportunity to be a little bit more luxurious, if you will, and kind of exploring where we go. So I think that if I were to say kind of an audience person, somebody who's really interested in the question I've always come back to is what if there's more? Mm-hmm. Is it this idea of okay, I think I have an understanding of what's happening. I see the world, I have some frame, but what if more is happening? And if the kind of person for whom that question is kind of exciting, and like sparks curiosity, as opposed to somebody who's like, nope, that's it. I don't want there to be more. So someone who's probably not, for whom that's a shutdown question, is probably not going to be as interested in the book as the person who hears, what if there's more, and goes, oh, I'm a little scared of that, but I'm now intrigued.
I think that's our audience. So that's a perfect pitch for them right there. As I read through it, I was so fascinated because it is not an easy read. And that is not at all how you wrote it. It's just the subject material. Because it's the kind of book where, like, I felt like twice a page I was stopping and going, I need to think for about 10 minutes here, you know, and my entire world is being reshaped. But at the same time, you reference Lord of the Rings, Narnia. You got a Weezer song stuck in my head, for crying out loud. You have Bluey reference in there, okay? So, like, if anyone's worried about this being too academic, it is not. It is very, very scholarly, well written, but it's also a fun read. And I loved seeing your personalities come out in that.
That's good to hear.
So, yeah, let's just hop into talking about it. And throughout the book, you have a lot that is based on the work of Jacques Lacan. Not Shaka Khan, Jacques Lacan, for any of our listeners who may not be familiar. So can you just give a really quick overview, if anyone has never heard that name before, who was Jacques Lacan and why does his work matter for this book?
Yeah, I'll jump in here because he's a French psychoanalytic thinker. So I was definitely the one sort of channeling the Lacanian theory into this.
Yeah.
As part of my background is I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So the world of psychoanalysis and that way of viewing the mind and the person, that's very much kind of where I come from. And I'm a professor, so I can go on for a while about that. But in short, Jacques Lacan is a French psychoanalyst. He got popular and sort of did a lot of his writings post-World War II. He passed away in 1981. And what's fascinating about him is he was considered a return to Freud. And in fact, sometimes was argued as being more Freudian than Freud. Because what he did, which I think is really interesting, is he was a modern reinterpretation of Freudian ideas. So while kind of American psychoanalytic thinking had taken Freud and sort of really camped down on what most people think of Freud, which is the Oedipus complex and superego and the id, and sort of been like, okay, that's that, and sort of defenses, he said, actually, let's reinterpret that through a linguistic lens. Like, take modern linguistics and reanalyze that. So he's sort of right on that cusp. He gets argued, is he post-structuralist or is he a structuralist? Kind of caught up in that post-war French intellectual scene. But he's reinterpreting Freud to actually allow Freud to breathe and to have more to say about the world. He was the kind of person who was upset if people called themselves Lacanians, because he's like, I'm not a Lacanian, I'm a Freudian. Because he would argue that he was going back to Freud and reinterpreting it. In my own journey with faith, it's been interesting to be kind of wooed by Lacan, because in many ways it sort of mirrored my relationship with the Bible, of like going back to the Bible and reinterpreting it, as opposed to simply taking the like interpretation that I was gifted as a child from the culture that we were raised in, but actually going back and being more curious about the primary texts and saying, well, what if there's more in there? And so Lacan is very much in that. So his approach is very much based on linguistics. He plays a lot with language. He's kind of right in that sort of post-structuralist milieu of and kind of French thinking. He's a little, I'll admit, I don't say this in the book, he's kind of niche. I'll admit that. In mental health circles, I'm aware he's niche. So if any of your listeners are familiar with like Pete Rollins or Zizek, they're both drawing off Lacanian ideas in kind of a little bit more popular space. So I'm building off of some of their work as well. He hasn't been as popular in the like Anglophone world, so kind of the Britain, US, Canada, and all that, because of how hard he was to translate a lot of his stuff, because it's on language, is playing with language, it's word plays. And he didn't play well with others and got kicked out of the International Psychoanalytic Association. So also there's sort of like a split between the French school and him, and then the rest of the IPA. So it's only been probably in the past 20, 30 years, there's been some newer interpretations of his work that he's started to make it more inroads into American psychoanalytic spaces. Anybody who's kind of been in humanities departments, in particular like film studies, are probably pretty familiar with him already, but he hasn't been as influential in the US within psychological or psychoanalytic spaces until more recently. That's probably a longer answer than I needed to give, but there you go.
No, with his dealing so much with like the linguistic play and all that, how does that affect Bible interpretation then? Because you mentioned studying that and then going back and reinterpreting scripture.
Oh, it's I think it's really fascinating, especially when we look at things in the Bible, like right off the bat, God in Genesis, God gives Adam the job of naming animals. So already language isn't something that necessarily comes from God. Language is something coming from humans, and God interacts with humans using language. And that's part of what Lacan says, is that one of the things that makes us conscious is actually that we are linguistic beings. We're caught up in this language, and language is then both individual, like it affects me, but it's also how I'm able to communicate and connect with you now. So it's this social and symbolic space that then shapes how I internalize and understand my world. When we think in language, and language sort of inhabits us, but it also splits us off, because language never quite says enough. Sort of like even talking to you now, you're picking up more about me than I intend you to pick up. And that's part of why it's scary to talk to other people, but it's also why it's beautiful. We learn more about ourselves when we connect to others because of the inherent failure of language. It never quite says what we want it to. It always says more and less. And it's in that failure that there's so much beauty and there's so much more that happens.
Yeah. All right. Love it. That piques my interest. So it's, I believe, the title of the book, you all came up with a new word, which is shockingly not a first for this podcast, because I've talked with Tom Ward about amipotence before. So second time we have people on making up new words. What is Eucontamination? For anyone listening, it is EU and then the word contamination. And why should the average Christian care about this if you're saying like this is central to the message of Jesus, but they've never heard that term in church before?
Oh, it's my turn. I was getting all excited over here. Okay, so like one of the things I'm going to try to do a transition here from actually what Paul was just saying, because Eucontamination, we've gone back and forth, and neither of us is quite sure which of us came up with the term, and it may have been sort of, it arose in this linguistic space between us out of a need to express a concept that we couldn't find a word for, right? And that's always this like tension creating space to be in, where you realize that there is something happening, and in order to think about it and to apply it and to get it to interact with other ideas, you need a container for it, right? You need a linguistic container for it, a word for it. We had been talking about disgust. This is why the subtitle for our book is Disgust, Theology, and the Christian Life, right? So disgust is kind of our initial wrestling partner in the book that leads us to this space of coming up with the term Eucontamination and then working for 7 chapters to apply it. So Eucontamination, again, it is just the Greek prefix eu, which means good. Contamination. So it really literally is just contamination for good. And I would say if Paul brings Lacan to the book, I probably brought C.S. Lewis to the book, right? In Mere Christianity, Lewis refers to Christ as a good infection to the world, right? And we were very much like, that had been brought into this like ongoing conversation that Paul and I were having around the time that Eucontamination got coined, again, to like make legible this conversational ideological space that we were kind of finding ourselves in. So it's good contamination, and we decided we needed a word for it rather than just saying good contamination a bunch of times. Partly because contamination itself has, I think, an unavoidably negative context, right? So our connotation, I should say, right? It's really hard to get away from a negative connotation of contamination. And that would not do for the thing we wanted to talk about, because we arrived at this concept when we had the sort of realization that Jesus shows up in the world and behaves not as though all disgust logic and the way that disgust and contamination and the way that people think about that and the way we think about that works, and we can get into that. He didn't behave as though all of that was just wrong and needs to be thrown away. He actually inverted and subverted it, and he acted as though he actually is a contamination, but he's a good contamination. He's a contamination that makes the world better, as though, in bringing and in giving us the Holy Spirit, in bringing himself, in the incarnation itself, Christ is in fact doing this thing that follows all the logic and rules of contamination, but is doing good for us, is transforming us into something healthier, better, more beautiful, more alive than we would otherwise have been. So we needed an unambiguously good word. And if you just take good and then add it to contamination, what you end up doing is creating this sense of modifying a bad thing, right? You're saying bad thing, no, but good, right? So you're still starting at the this is a bad thing space. And we were hoping that by coining a new word, we would be able to, like, you sort of create this new impression of, okay, this is a thing that is a good thing, and it follows the rules and processes and methods of contamination.
Okay. Yeah. I can't help but think that in 10 minutes now, we have already got some people a little overwhelmed in what we're talking about. So let's go into that for a second. You're talking about how Jesus plays by these rules that it operates the way a contagion and infection would work, but without the negative stereotype that comes with that. Can you maybe give some examples from his life and ministry of what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jesus, right? Jesus, I mean, the one that I think comes to most people's mind first is Jesus touches lepers. Jesus, right? The way that we see Jesus interacting with the concept of cleanness, as it's generally translated in the Bible, right? Or purity. But the way that Jesus actually interacts with things that are admittedly in his day, and we would probably even now say like sinful, wrong, or harmful, right? Things like leprosy, right? He did not act as though those things could infect him or contaminate him or make him bad or unholy or impure. In fact, instead, he acted as though his presence purified or made holy, transformed into good these things, right? When he comes into contact with a leper, he doesn't get leprosy. The leper is cured, right? So, and that's the inversion. Normally, like if I come into contact with a leper, absent some phenomenal miracle, I'm just going to get leprosy, right? Like which does not be great for me, right? Because leprosy is a contaminant, right? It is actually, you know, like there are germs involved there, or however it is it spreads. But this is a sickness that is contagious. And Jesus behaves and operates as a more powerful good contamination that overcomes all things. And we thought that was weird. We thought that was notable. So that, you know, this obviously drives further research and drove us back into to studying the Gospels and studying the epistles and studying the Old Testament and trying to get a hold on what is God doing here.
But I jump in there with also like the metaphors Jesus uses: salt, light, leaven, right? All of these are metaphors of contamination. It only takes a tiny candle in a room to bring suddenly the darkness gets dispelled. Right. Whereas like a little bit of darkness in a bright room does nothing. All right. It's a little bit of salt that works through the rest of the food. It's a little bit of yeast that works through the bread. Right. It's this idea that the tiny thing. And what was significant is typically in disgust, that tiny thing is the gross thing that needs to be kept out. Right. We don't ask if you found out someone else had spat in your drink, you don't ask, well, how much? If it was just a little drop, that's an irrelevant question, right? Because with disgust, it's any amount. Whereas Jesus, instead of seeing himself as holy, so I need to be now this kind of fragile, protected, sealed off entity, actually said, no, I'm going to go into the world and I'm going to like infect you, but it's going to infect you for good. So yes, it is the tiny thing that breaks in.
Mustard seed, right? To go along with more of his parables. Yeah.
Or I mean, the Eucharist is another great example. Like drink my blood, and that is part of what heals you. Again, there's different theologies there around that, but this idea of like we imbibe Jesus, and it's this small thing that we eat that actually then purifies us, as opposed to God becoming contaminated by our sin in coming in contact with us, which is like that obviously is kind of some heresy there.
Yeah, that's huge. And everything you said is stuff that the average churchgoer is familiar with, but I don't think we've ever thought of it from this angle. Are you familiar with Bible Project?
A little bit.
They do. Yeah, they do podcasts.
Seen some of their videos.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the work of Michael Heiser? Okay, I wasn't sure. He was a little more niche. He was into a lot of like talking about the supernatural world of the Bible and how the biblical authors drew on the mythologies of the ancient Near East around them, and his work influenced Bible Project. So if I can go on like a 2-minute tangent here, this all sparked thoughts in my head here that connected as I was reading through the book. So something that both he, Michael Heiser, and Bible Project have talked about is like imagining God almost like the sun. If you've got the sun in space, it's good. It brings heat, light to the world. But if you get too close to it, you're going to burn up. And it's in space. We don't exist in space. And that's why, like in the Bible, when you have somebody that sees an angel or some supernatural being, they freak out because they're thinking this is a supernatural creature from another realm. I can't exist in the same realm that they are. If you blinked your eyes and open them in space, you go, I'm about to die. But they said, if you kind of imagine that, like God's holiness being, I don't think they use the word contagious, but almost being like the sun there, where like you need some sort of a buffer through a lot of the Bible. If we're going into space, we have a spacesuit. If you're in the Old Testament, you have blood on the doorpost or a priest in the tabernacle, what have you. And then part of the message of Jesus is that you don't need that buffer anymore. And it's like God's holiness is so powerful. It's not bad. Like if we think of Indiana Jones with the Ark of the Covenant and face melting off Nazis, it's not like God is punishing people when they die in his presence, like Uzzah reaching out and touching the ark. It's just, what if his holiness is so powerful, mortal creatures can't exist in it? And then Jesus comes along and says, well, what if actually his holiness can exist at full power inside you? And that's where we have the Spirit join us as we are, like little temples throughout as the body of Christ. So it all kind of connected a little bit there, I thought, to your contagious holiness idea. So
yeah, no, the whole concept of like, with the incarnation, and then again, I think we also like have to come back to this again at Pentecost, right? But the infection of humanity, of personness, of the world with divinity, is this like massive, and this sort of massive major thing. I also think I think it's a really good idea to keep in mind that this is ongoing. Like one of the things that we talk about in the book is how preoccupied humanity tends to be with protecting ourselves from that raw or naked exposure to reality, to the real, to the Lacanian real, the kind of that baseline order of reality that is still sort of too much for us, right? Like I was thinking the other day about John 16, where Jesus sort of says, you're not ready for all of it yet. Like I've got more to tell you, but you're not ready yet, right? And is Jesus is kind of aware that we have, that on the one hand, the incarnation represents the contamination of humanity with divinity. All right, I'm a big fan of like the Athanasian Creed on this point, and at the same time, this is an ongoing process that we are transformed and being transformed.
Yes. Love that. You talk in the book about disgust a lot. And I think most Christians would say, oh, Christianity is all about love. Well, those of us who grew up in it know a lot of times it is just as much about fear as it is about love. But you say that it's not fear as much that's the problem as disgust. How so?
Yeah. So when we're talking about emotions, it's first, this is the sort of professor side of me to come out and be like, things are more complicated than I'm going to say here. But for the sake of clarity, I'm going to say some overgeneralizations to help distinguish. Fear and disgust are both really important aspects, kind of emotional aspects of the self that help keep us safe. Right? Fear isn't a negative thing. It's what helps you respond in a kind of healthy way when there is a threat. When there's a conscious threat, there's something that could get you. You get fear, and it's that like fight, flight, freeze, faint thing that helps keep you alive. Fear is really good on that. Now, obviously, fear can go too far. Fear can be misused. Fear can be misapplied. And so there's a lot of ways that fear turns into anxiety and all these other kind of mental health issues. But fear is something we can talk about. And I think this has to do with more with our cultural milieu, this idea that like, it's okay to be afraid of something, but we're kind of conditioned not to think of ourselves as disgusted by things, by people in particular. Like you may be a threat to me, but if I think you're disgusting, that's already, there's some moral judgments happening in there. There's some sort of aspects getting in there. But even as like movies like Inside Out, like disgust is kind of one of those central emotions that are there.
Yeah.
Disgust comes about to help differentiate what's me and what's not me when there's ambiguity. Okay. So disgust is all about the formation of the self. The sense of self is deeply connected to disgust. So some of the kind of silly ways of this, and again, we're going to talk about disgust, so slight trigger warning for those of you who are more easily nauseous. One of the thought experiments they often do with this is they'll ask you to spit into a sterile cup, and then ask how many of you would drink the spit if asked to. Most people say absolutely not. That's gross. Well, why is it gross? We're all drinking right now and we're swallowing our spit. But as soon as it leaves our mouth, it's no longer saliva. Now it's spit. Now it's not me. And so disgust brings this clarity in the space of uncertainty, right? The same thing happens with our hair. Like there's nothing wrong with playing with your hair right now, but as soon as the hair's off of you, oh, get that, right?
I thought about that. There's one of the Seinfeld bits that he would do at the start of one of the episodes. He said that like that's proof we're so irrational because you'll run your hand through somebody's hair, but the second it's off of their head, you go, it's the hair.
Exactly. And that's one of the things we want to highlight with disgust is that it's actually, we'd say, pre-rational. You are disgusted by something before the part of your brain that would tell a story to make sense of it has caught up. So what happens is you're disgusted, and then you come up with a reason to justify your disgust.
Okay.
And so this is why we want to argue about the importance of disgust, because while fear often responds, again, not always, there's more to it than that, but fear will often respond to reason. If there's a, I give the example, if a bear walked into my office, I would be afraid. If a bear tamer walked after the bear and the bear was docile, I could calm my fear. Right? However, even if I know that like it's a gag gift plastic turd, I still don't want to touch it.
Sure.
Or even the hair thing. Like, I know it was still my hair, but please, let's just get it off of me, right? The disgust doesn't respond to reason because it's coming before the reason. The reason is actually more rationalization than it is causal reason.
And how then does that play into talking about eucontamination? Like, if we're talking about something that we just see and we think is disgusting, how then does that work in this discussion?
So if we think about what I said around disgust, navigating what's me, what's not me, that is active on an individual level. It's also active on a collective level. Who is us and who is not us. And what's fascinating about love is love requires actually that boundary to be a little bit more confused, a little bit more flexible as we allow each other to impact one another. Like, I love my sister. She has had a big impact on me. She has changed me. Our relationship isn't the same. We aren't the same people because of the sort of ways that we've connected with each other. Right? The same thing happens when we allow someone into our community, we allow someone into our family, the community changes. However, when disgust is present, we're no longer dealing with people as full humans. We're dealing with them as objects of disgust, as others. And so disgust runs into what you mentioned earlier, the commandment to love. If you're disgusted by someone, you're not actually in a position where you're loving them. You're actually objectifying them. They're an object that can't be us.
Yeah.
And then you're going to tell yourself a story to make sense of it. So this is where we see like disgust present in things like racism and sexism and nationalism and all these other sort of isms that alienate and other and oppress people, because they become these justifications to help keep this sense of me safe, the sense of us safe. Billy, you're going to jump in?
I was just going to give a little example. I was telling somebody about this the other day. I mean, sort of from my own history. I was, years before I came out, right? I'm very much a proud queer woman. But before I came out, before I even knew that I was queer, I was kicked out of a church for being affirming, because my theology was affirming, and I was pretty open and loud about that online. And I was told that the existence of my theology was preventing a move of the Holy Spirit in the church. It was a charismatic vineyard church. Right? And I've told that story to quite a few people, and the most common reaction I get from, sort of affirming, Christians who would be sympathetic to my experience, right, is they sort of find it flabbergasting and odd and strange, right? And they're like, wow, that doesn't make any sense. Like, imagine the hubris and like what a strange idea that like one little person's, even if they were right that your theology was wrong, like how is that going to stop like the Holy Spirit? And I always say, like, well, the thing is, if you analyze that from fear, if fear is your sort of analytic tool for that, you're right. It makes no sense. It's pretty irrational, right? If disgust is your analytic tool, then what becomes really obvious is that if you believe that in order for the Holy Spirit to show up, you have to be pure, you have to be holy, right? Then it doesn't matter how much of the quote sin is present, you believe is present, it has to be expelled, it has to be got rid of. And you can tell yourself a story about why that was after you've done it, but you have to get it out first, right? So what we find really helpful is, and this is just one example, but I think we actually see this sort of thing happening a lot, where you see these behaviors that do not make a whole lot of sense if you imagine fear as kind of the motivating factor here. But once you substitute out fear for disgust, it does make sense. It does fall into place. And that means that if we want to correct some of these things, we need to be addressing the right problem. We need to be addressing the right sort of emotion. Because if we treat it like it's fear when it's disgust, we're not going to be, we're not going to be on the same page. We're not going to communicate well. We're not going to lead to growth with one another.
Wrong medication for the issue.
Exactly.
But yeah, and if you've ever, if you ever talk to somebody who finds something gross, trying to tell them why it's not dangerous doesn't change anything. It has no impact. No, it's still gross. It's just gross to me. And that's just the end of the story. Whereas if something's dangerous, I can have a conversation with you about risk management and about how do we kind of deal it in a way that's going to kind of lower the threat and make it safe enough for you to engage in, right? Like we all drive cars or ride in cars, and that's inherently risky, but we wear seatbelts and we follow laws and we do, driver's licenses and things to lower the risk. because it's not a disgust-induced resistance. It's fear. So we're able to lower it to a place where we feel safe enough to drive. Whereas when we're dealing with disgust, it's like, no, it's still just gross to me. Just get it away.
Yep.
I think anybody who's ever had an argument with their toddler about eating food that the toddler doesn't want to eat has run into this problem, right? Like the problem is they're experiencing the food is disgusting. Like it's gross. They don't want to eat it. They're not going to say that. What they say is, I'm full. And then you say, okay, well then no dessert if you're full. No, I want dessert because then you're not full, right? So you can logically deconstruct all of their arguments, but they're just going to keep coming up with more and probably get more and more irritated with you because you're trying to expose, knowing it or not. What you're doing is you're working closer and closer to exposing the fact that their reason is disgust. It's just ooh. It's just yuck, right? But we want to rationalize that. We want to dress that up. We want to come up. We don't like to think of ourselves as not having good rationale for what we do. So we come up with justifications.
Yeah, that's a huge distinction to make. It can seem, I don't want to say like splitting hairs, but like I think it's easy to miss how important that distinction is because, you talked about having people say, oh, how could your having a little bit of a different view on something affect the entire church like that? And sadly, I'm sitting here going, nope, I totally understand that response coming from fundamental Baptist circles. And, like not even touching on queer or LGBT issues, just having a different theology. We look at and go, oh, don't you dare read Rob Bell or, that like they wouldn't even know the names of people from beer camp like Tripp or Pete Enns or anything like that, right? It's just do not even dare pick up the book. I remember there was one time I was at a camp as a teenager down in North Carolina, and for whatever reason, the camp counselor is Bob Jones affiliated, so very conservative camp, but he had one of the Harry Potter movies in his in the cabin. It's not like there was a TV there or anything, so I don't even know why he had a DVD. But one of the kids found it and would not even touch the DVD case. Because Harry Potter is evil and witchcraft, and there's just something about it. And it's that kind of thing. Like if you actually walk through it logically, what about this DVD case? Even if it was truly evil, what is it going to do to you? But people don't think that way once they have that disgust triggered. And we've talked here about purity. So I want to go into that for a minute because I absolutely came from purity culture. And so all of the illustrations you gave in the book, having poop in the brownies, spit in the cup, chewed gum, passing the rose around to everyone, I heard all of that. It affected how I saw myself and absolutely, especially the girls that were in the youth group. So I think more and more people are realizing that purity culture has harm to it. But through the lens of Eucontamination, you show that it's also thoroughly unbiblical. And can you talk a little bit about how Eucontamination shows just how bad purity culture is?
Yeah, I think I touched on this like a little bit with the example, but let's dive in real deep, right? So the way that disgust, again, logic works, and what you're gonna hear from like scholars of disgust. It's fun that there are scholars of disgust. You're gonna hear from scholars of disgust.
Different from disgusting scholars.
Right.
That is true. There may be some overlap, but not the same.
Right, is that power in the contamination purity space. Power is all on the side of the contaminant. Again, remember what Paul was saying about like dose insensitivity, right? Just a tiny bit of contaminant contaminates an entire pure substance, right? The example I use all the time is that if you have a swimming pool's worth of pure water, and I ask you, are you willing to drink a cup of this? As long as you're convinced that it is actually pure water, you probably will be, right? Dip a cup in, take a sip. If you see me add one eyedropper of urine to it, you probably won't, right? Like just this relatively tiny amount has contaminated the entire thing.
If not even the idea that I might have put an eyedropper in there.
Like, just talking about that, some of the people listening right now are probably cringing.
Right. No, absolutely. Right. I think Paul, I think it made it in the book where Paul says you're really mean to somebody if you start talking about poop while they have a spoonful of peanut butter next to them. Right. Just the idea can like really contaminate it. Right. That's just the idea of it is contaminating. But if you flip that around, if I present to you I'm sorry, but a swimming pool full of urine, and then I add, say, don't worry, and I add an eyedropper of pure water to it, you're still not going to drink it, right? The power is all on the side of the contaminant. The pure thing is fragile and has to be kept fragile. This is not, like, that's just how that works for us psychologically. It needs to, because again, if you take any amount of germs into your body, you're going to get sick. Like you want to keep these small, presumed, like for most of civilization, like invisible substances, got to keep those.
You want to
Poison,
keep
right.
little bits of poison out of your body because it doesn't
Mhm.
take much to kill you.
So it's not like it's a fundamental problem or even like wrong when applied to the right things.
Mhm.
And then the Bible uses a lot of language around purity, and it equates purity with holiness and goodness and so forth, right? Because those things are good and they are alloyed good, right? Like goodness really is fully good. There's nothing of evil in God's goodness, and that's fine and that's good. Again, that is reading what we would say that is reading the metaphor appropriately, right? The problem comes in when we over apply a metaphor, right? Like, so in the book we try to use some sort of silly examples where we talk about like Jesus is the Lamb of God, but you don't want to make a sweater out of his hair, right? Like you can only take these metaphors so far. They're meant to convey a particular similarity, not more similarities than they specifically are meant to convey. And what we would argue has happened is that in purity culture and in a lot of other contexts, but especially in purity culture, we've taken this concept of purity and we have over applied the metaphor to where we start applying this logic of disgust and contamination to goodness, right? And so what this means is that we are treating, when you do that, you treat what you see as good or holy and right as fragile, and what you see as sinful or wrong or harmful as contaminating, right? So instead of having a healthy conversation with teenagers about sex and the consequences of sex and consensual sex and like the decisions that are involved and why this might be a really significant decision you want to make, and having these like slow and thought out and loving conversations with people, we end up saying, if you allow any of this, you are ruined. You are transformed into not just like, not only are you contaminated, but, and then this becomes the second sort of part of the logic of contamination. You're not just contaminated, you are therefore contaminating. Because in the logic of disgust, a contaminated thing, contamination, disgust is sticky, is the language that the scholars use, right? That is, once you've gotten a sticky substance on yourself, one of the horrible things about having sticky stuff on you is that anything you touch now is going to get that same sticky stuff on it, right? Like it transfers, it's contagious, right? So it's not only are you contaminated, which means that you're transformed into something you didn't want to be by, again, if we're talking about purity culture, by sex. And usually this, and this is, again, go back to your, like, this is the camper who's afraid to even touch the Harry Potter thing, right? Because you can't be any degree of contaminated by the thing, because then not only will you be ruined, again, scare quotes,
right,
but you will also become somebody who ruins others, right? You will become a vector of contamination to other people, which means you have to be a pariah. It means you are going to have to be stigmatized, cast out. You are going to have to be either go through a very painful, socially or physically painful cleansing ritual, or you're just going to have to be cast out of the circle of us and what's good. This is all profoundly harmful. I mean, this is more, talking about the kind of psychological and long-term harms of this is probably more Paul's domain than mine at this point, right? But I would say that at a theological level, this is fundamentally blasphemous, right? Like, this is fundamental, and I'm a good progressive Christian. I don't use that language lightly, right? But it's fundamentally blasphemous because this is fundamentally the claim, and I think any Orthodox, conservative, even fundamentalist Christian would have a problem with the claim that sin is more powerful than God.
There it is.
And yet purity culture has always assumed that. Purity culture relies on that implicit belief in order to function the way it does.
Yep. Man, I feel like I just need to sit with that for a minute. That is very true. And I had a thought as you were saying that too, of how that could potentially play into when someone leaves a church. Because I remember growing up in the fundamentalist church, how often someone would leave for one reason or another. And it always had to be the quiet leaving. You don't talk about why. You don't want to spread dissension or, any of that. And you just get to a point where people go, well, what happened to so-and-so? They're not here anymore. And no one knows. You go, well, I haven't talked to them. And it just makes me wonder, now that I'm about 2 years out of the church that I grew up in, some of that plays into why people don't reach out when you leave, because they're scared. And it might come across as fear, but maybe there's that little bit of disgust in there where it's not rational, it's pre-rational, and they just see you as the other now. That if they get too close, whatever contaminated you to leave the church might infect them as well.
Because disgust transmit kind of these magical associative lines. It's associations, even thinking about it, or it's having connection to it. It's not on these rational lines of fear. But again, we translate our disgust reaction into a fear reaction to help us make sense of it. So we'll often tell ourselves a story around fear because that makes sense. This is a threat.
Right.
But oftentimes if we unpack that and we slow it down, there's a disgust response actually taking place.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about there, and I think that subconscious way that's playing, or I'm always afraid that I'm using that word wrong where I'm Paul. But the way that's playing out, right, is that you see this happening where stigma is sort of one way of thinking about disgust at a social level, right? If I reach out to the people that have gone from church and I'm still friends with them and I know them, right? I'm stigmatized by whatever it is that caused them to leave, right? Again, it's that stickiness transfers over, and we don't want to acknowledge that because once we name it, we have to ask whether or not it's true, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not it makes any sense. As long as we don't name it, it just continues to operate, and we can have control enough to be safe from that infection of us.
It doesn't force us to ask any questions of ourselves and wonder whether the other person could have been right and we could have been wrong.
Yep.
Now, you also talk about not just purity culture, but Christian nationalism in the book. And I don't know that I had necessarily made the connection quite the way that you do before. I hadn't made it before the way that you do in the book. So how does this assumed theology of contamination undergird the current state of evangelicalism that we have today?
Yeah, Billy's probably got a little bit more on this than I do, but the idea of Christian nationalism, and one of the ideas that kind of fuels it, is this kind of purity metaphor, this purity idea that there has to be a pure sense of who's really us, who's really American, who's really Christian. And the problem with, there's a lot of problems with that, but what that means is that that's protected on disgust lines. So then anyone who's associated with not us is a contaminant, is a threat. And when disgust is operating, we're also now, again, we're objectifying the entire swaths of the world who don't fit us because they're not humans that we can interact with. No, they're disgusting. They're others. There was a Babylon Bee article, which is sort of like the hyper conservative Christian version of The Onion, that had this whole thing of like one of their kind of horrific joke essays was the like, I think it was, Billy, correct me if I'm wrong here, it was sort of like the detoxing parade after the Pride Parade. And they were talking about the annual, which speaks to this disgust reaction. They see those who would have participated in a Pride Parade as contaminating, as less than human, as these dangerous and kind of disgusting contaminants, which is implicitly dehumanizing. And that's part of what happens in Christian nationalism. It's one of these ways that purity takes over. And part of the like terrifying part of it, right, is that, and we get into some of the nuances of this in the book, but nobody actually belongs to that myth of pure. Who we are is always messier. And this is where things around unconscious desire, around the way identity actually works, and around the way like who the self is far more permeable than any of us want to acknowledge or often think. And so that idea of like that I can belong to a group requires somebody else belonging less than me. Somebody has to be like less of an insider than me so that I can feel like I belong. And my belonging, my sense of belonging is predicated on my like ostracizing them.
We need a scapegoat.
Exactly. This is the Girardian scapegoat mechanism. And so Christian nationalism is built on the scapegoat. It requires an other to maintain this fantasy of a pure center, of a pure group of real Christians or real Americans or real whatever they want to do. And those are now typically along gender and sexuality and racial lines, along with religious and particular affiliations like that. Billy probably has more to say. I could talk about on that like sociological, psychological side, but that's where you see disgust operating. And that's why so much of the language, right? If you listen to the language of politicians operating from this, it's disgust. They'll talk about fear and threat, but actually they say, if we just let one terrorist in, quote unquote, then the purity of the nation, or they talk about the blood of the nation, or they talk like these are purity metaphors. This is disgust logic. That's not fear.
So everything you're talking about here is very relevant with immigration discussions then as well.
Absolutely
relevant. Yeah, no, right. So I just want a little bit more context on this one is that nationalism, right, to use Benedict Anderson's definition, right, is that nationalism is all about the formation of an imagined community, right? And what that what that entails, I really should say, is a reliance on disgust to police the purity of the imagined community, right? So, and this exists, and this operates both at the actual, social level, keeping people, physical bodies out of our community space that we feel should not be allowed, that we can't bear to imagine as part of us, right? And it also exists at the level of thought and understanding, whereas I can't even bear to be like pushed to think of them as part of us or as constituting my understanding of us, right? There is this that cannot be allowed at all. And Paul's absolutely right. I was thinking while he was talking about that dynamic of the fact that we never quite fit, and so we require a scapegoat. We need to find somebody who fits even less than us that we can point to and be pushing out in order to reassure ourselves that we still qualify, that we still get to count as in, right? And there's an old saying about fascism, that fascism is a beast that eats, right? And it's a saying that's meant to identify the fact that the concentric circles of who counts as in within a fascist hierarchy are always shrinking, right? They're like anytime whoever's on the bottom in who is the current target of fascism, once they get rid of that group, they're going to go for the next group up and the next group up until there's just one person left standing alone by themselves over a destroyed world, right?
Do you think, if I can interrupt for just a second, do you think that's why we're finding so much of politics becoming more extreme on either end? Because like the more we draw these circles, the more we have to get ultra conservative or ultra progressive to fit in, because we're making a broader circle of who is less true to the ideal than we are.
I'd say yes, but I'd also, like, the other sad part of it is that it's also on particular levels, it's also effective. How do you whip people into shape? Like, I don't have to give you a rational argument why like immigrants are dangerous if I can make you disgusted by the thought of immigration. I don't need to convince you.
They're eating dogs. They're doing right.
Exactly. If I can trigger your disgust mechanism, I can actually avoid even having to make a rational argument.
You'll make it for me, right? Like, because you're going to celebrate, participate in the expulsion, right? And then once you've done it, you're going to tell yourself a story about why that was the right thing to do. So you'll make the argument for me and be far more effective in convincing yourself than I would ever be.
Because part of what it offers you is a sense of belonging. You now feel like you have a group, like you belong, because you've been able to spit that out. And that's one of the like really scary parts that we see on kind of any time you see groups form, is that like that sense of community and belonging, like we're often very drawn towards because we feel this sense of unease. But sometimes the places that offer it the strongest often are actually utilizing weaponizing disgust in some of the more insidious ways. And so the desire to belong, it actually gets kind of subverted into a rejection of other people and a dehumanization of other people. So that desire to be part of the us.
Yeah, I want to caveat. I was thinking back to, I do agree that like this is a problem that is like endemic to being human in the world, right? Like there's a level of a degree to which it's a natural temptation, right, to start to be invested in the purity of the us, and then the rejection of those who are like heterodox or those who are a threat to that perceived purity. And at the same time, communities that celebrate diversity are themselves building up their own sort of internal immune system against those pernicious forms of disgust settling in. So where I would say that yes, there is a degree to which this dynamic operates on the right and the left. Presently, it is far more pernicious and powerful on the right than it is on the left.
Yes.
Even if you just want to say that it's by historical accident that the left has chosen diversity as its cause célèbre, where the right has chosen diversity as its whipping boy, right? Like the right has decided that it hates diversity, and you have these sort of right-wing talking heads going on about like, why would we even say it was a good thing? And unity is our strength, not diversity, right? When they're saying all of these things, what they're actually doing is empowering a disgust response rather than disempowering a social and political disgust response. So there is I would say there's a little bit more natural ideological buffer against this dynamic fully setting in on the left and on the right. Although I do agree with you that there's a degree to which it's in play kind of no matter what happens once you start setting these sort of litmus tests and purity requirements.
It almost makes it sound like a gang induction. Like I have to sacrifice the humanity of another person to fit with my group now.
Yeah.
I don't need to go too deeply down here, but that's a little bit of what actually like becoming a self and a conscious being in the world is. You actually cut off part of your experience to be a me, and that's actually where consciousness and your ego is from. And that's why there's always, Jung would call it a shadow side, Lacan would call it your unconscious aspects. There's always a more to you than you think there is.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where like you do something, be like, I can't believe I did that. I don't know who I was. Well, it always was you. It just didn't fit into the image of who you thought you were supposed to be. And that's sort of discussed operating on the individual side, which is a forced choice of cutting part of yourself off. And then it also operates then on the social side. And it's rarely, it's not a conscious decision where you go, I think I'll go ahead and sacrifice those people, because it goes before our conscious minds have actually caught up. It's part of our desire.
If any of you listening are going, man, what is Paul going on with this psychoanalyst stuff here? I'm going, that kind of sounds central to Christianity. Like, you ever read Paul's letters?
Right.
The things that I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Like, this is not modern, liberal, hippie, anything. This is old. This is as old as humanity has been around. We're just slightly changing the terms we use to talk about it.
Right. What we will be has not yet been revealed, even to us. Right. Like there is more to us that God knows than even that we know, and we are discovering who we are.
Yeah, love
one
it.
of the parts of the book, I had a lot of fun, and I was playing with what was the section, and we talk about the fruits of the spirit. And Paul's got that whole section of the desires of the flesh and the desires of the spirit. So we don't know what we want. This is deeply psychoanalytic. This is actually like what psychoanalysis is trying to describe. And it's this question of, what does it mean to actually be free? What does it mean to be free, instead of just being a rebel without a cause, or I'm just pushing back against because, or I'm just doing because they told me to. And we're so often caught between those to not know, what do we actually want? And if Christ has set us free, as Paul writes, what does that even mean? That's a little bit where we get into of like being free to actually explore your own desire.
Let's follow that thought process out for a minute here, because we've talked a lot about the philosophy and psychology of it. How does this Eucontamination reshape everyday Christianity? Like, when everyone finishes the episode, how will this new way of thinking about Christianity and Jesus, and how does that affect the day-to-day?
So, Billy, it's all right, I'll jump in with...
No, I think you should absolutely answer this one.
So my first thought is, I remember a friend of mine telling me that he once thought of his faith as like a football, and that his whole... He was supposed to have his faith, hold it, and then run to the end zone and hope it didn't get ripped out of his hands before he died. And that's how we go to heaven. Right? And this idea that like...
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like what I grew up with. Absolutely.
And I think that's a lot of what like the evangelical church has done. And it's this fear. And I remember going to youth groups and everything, being taught how to defend my faith. And this is the whole apologetics movement. What Eucontamination does is say, what if your faith is a gift to the rest of the world? Right? What if instead of a football that you need to protect it from, what if in fact you don't need to be afraid of what the rest of the world offers you? And in fact, that's going to help you become more like Christ if you can wrestle with it. If you can allow that in. And so instead of fearing that your faith is going to be contaminated, what if your faith is part of what contaminates? And maybe they have something to contaminate you that you don't even have words for yet. What if they have gifts for you that can help you see Jesus better? There's always, this may be a side tangent, feel free to edit this out, but when I first started therapy, like as a therapist, I was working with adolescents who actually been adjudicated for sexual crimes, and sort of this sort of population that's kind of often considered sort of disgusting and sort of the lowest of lows. And I remember being struck by how much working with them taught me about Jesus. And I think what Eucontamination offers us is an open to saying, what if we can learn more about Jesus, learn more about what it means to love from others, instead of fearing, instead of being disgusted by being changed? Actually, we're open to it, because greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world, right? There's this sort of
so biblical
inversion of how we think about our faith.
Yeah.
And so I think on a fundamental, it just changes your posture, right? And for those of you not on the video, I'm sort of hunching over for the football and trying to open up for the other. I think it changes your internal posture, because it says, actually, I can be excited about mystery. I can be excited about wonder. I can be curious about things instead of having to convince myself I already know, which is a form of death. Instead of desiring more, I'd be shutting it down. So I think the first thing it offers kind of us everyday Christians is to change our posture towards others, towards the world, towards that which is different and scary, to say, actually, maybe we have a lot to learn, and maybe we have a chance of infecting.
If Jesus is our model and he wasn't afraid of everything around him, but rather thought that he could be the affecting for good, then maybe we've been looking at this all wrong.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And no, I was actually, with Paul was talking, I was thinking about one of the points that our dad really likes to make is he likes to point to the movie The Emperor's New Groove, where there's the line where the Emperor points out to Yzma, "You're doing my job again," right? And he likes to say the Christians keep saying that, or the Holy Spirit keeps having to say that to Christians, right? Is "You're doing my job again," right? And I would offer that Eucontamination and apply, and using a Eucontaminating framework and way to think about our faith actually really helps us to step back and let the Holy Spirit do the Holy Spirit's work. And that can mean bringing in truths that you contaminate our current version of faith, transforming them into something closer to the heart of Christ, and taking elements of our faith and using those to Eucontaminate other people's worlds. But that's not something we do, right? That's not something we do by keeping our faith intact like a little football or missile and then shooting it into other people's worlds, right? That's something we share this thing. We just be openly ourselves and hold our faith with open hands, allowing it both to be Eucontaminated and allowing the Holy Spirit to use it to Eucontaminate others. It's just a lot less stressful.
Absolutely. And now I'm just picturing God coming up to you and going, "So who's in my chair?" It's great. So if you are someone who has a level of influence in a church, maybe on staff or even just teaching a Sunday school or something like that, how can churches begin to train their members not to give into disgust when they are triggered by it, maybe in the news or in something that they heard another preacher say? Like, how can we start to overcome that as a church body and see ourselves more as Eucontaminating?
So the first thing that I think of is, one, be open to the fact that you are disgusted. Just start with that as an opening of like, hey, am I disgusted by this? Because I'm going to tell myself a story about like, oh my goodness, that's so scary. Right? Who doesn't watch the news and feels fear, feels their bodily response happen? And we often translate that as fear because they are scary. Oftentimes there's a disgust reaction happening in there. And so the first one is just being open to the disgust is probably present. Once we're there, once we can notice it, now we're actually in a position to do something about it, to start evaluating it, right? Because there are times disgust is actually really helpful. Like we wrote this initially during the COVID pandemic. So like disgust was actually really important to keep people alive. It's not that disgust is bad, but it does, like all emotions, right? We kind of want to be able to listen to it and then be curious about its utility in any particular situation, right? Like fear is good, but sometimes I need to give a speech in front of people. And so I'm going to feel my fear, but yet I'm going to do the scary thing anyway, because this is better for me. And sometimes fear helps me realize I shouldn't maybe get in the car with that person, right? Sometimes like there are times that we listen to it. And so we need to have a more mature relationship with disgust, which first needs to help. I would argue we need to recognize that it exists and that it does impact us. Too often, I think churches in particular have this idea of like, oh, we're just nice people. Oh, we love everybody. And so we tell this story about ourselves that precludes us from recognizing, no, we are actually also driven by disgust. It is operating there. So to think that we've somehow transcended it puts us so firmly in its grasp. It means it's operating below the surface. So first is to allow it in the surface. And then we can engage it with a form of mindfulness and a little bit more clarity of how then do we want to bring this forward. I'll let Billy say a little bit more on that. But one of the things, okay, there's just a fun part of like, how do you transcend disgust? Like, how do you change it if it's pre-rational, right? Yeah. So I have children and I have potty trained all my kids with the support of my wife. And so that means I've had to wipe them. And that's gross, but it is fundamentally different than dealing with any other human's feces. Because I love my kids. And because of the relationship I have with my kids, my relationship with their excrement is fundamentally different. So intimacy is this whole other side that actually completely upends our view of disgust, right? That same stuff we talked about with kind of revulsion by bodily fluids and saliva and things gets completely upended in romantic relationships with your partner, where suddenly kissing is a beautiful thing for most allosexual people, right? There's a complete like inversion that happens. So recognizing we're disgusted and then moving towards intimacy in mindfulness. There are people who are harmful. And so we want to be able to engage them wisely. We want to recognize the actual threat and risk, not the disgust. So this doesn't mean you just lower boundaries and let people hurt you. It does
Mm.
mean you recognize when you're pre-rationally resisting them and objectifying them, as opposed to kind of understanding the risk and in community connecting, but always holding out hope for intimacy.
Love that. There may be a little overlap in some of what we've talked about before here, but as we're wrapping up the conversation, what is one takeaway that you hope sticks with the listeners on a gut level? Even if they forget psychoanalytic terminology, what is like the one main thing that you hope they take away from this?
I just talked a lot, Billy. You go first.
Oh, that you are, I'm going to cheat, but I'm going to say that you are Eucontaminated and Eucontaminating, right? That is to say that, yes, you are disgusting and yes, you are disgusted, but that there is something in you that is beautiful and valuable to the entire world. And that what you are is not a product of individuality and like you have built yourself out of rock. What you are is a product of being infected by everyone you have ever known in ways. You are a product of everybody who has ever loved you, who has ever interacted with you. And I think I hope that changes and makes people's lives better to remember.
It's beautiful. Paul?
Yeah, I think I'd leave with just this sort of playful orientation to what if there's more? What if there's more going on? And can you be open to what if there's more to you? What if there's more at play? What if there's more in the other? What if there's more happening between us? And I think what the Holy Spirit gives us is the ability to approach that joyfully and with curiosity, as opposed to with fear and shame and disgust.
They say that philosophy begins in wonder, and I think that faith and a flourishing life do as well.
Love those. And I loved reading through the book. I was able to get a copy of it, and like I said at the start, it's not a quick read. And yet I still found myself going through just chapter after chapter. I'm like, I can't put this down. I have to get through this. And not just for the episode. I just found it very fascinating. And it forced me to think about myself in ways I hadn't before, and to think about other people in ways I hadn't before. So honestly, if you have listened to this episode, I would just recommend the book to you. It should be on sale within the next couple weeks. I'll put a link to it on the show notes as soon as it is. And I'd say just give it a read. Be prepared for it to take a little bit of time, because you're going to have to think a lot, but I believe it can change your life for sure. So if you are a frequent listener to the podcast, normally we'll end saying, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. But today I want to do something a little bit different, because at the end of Eucontamination, Billy and Paul have a few liturgies that they have listed as kind of an appendix. And if you came from a Baptist tradition like mine, you're going to say, what the heck is this? But that's okay, because even if you do come from a more liturgical tradition, you might not quite recognize this one. This is the Litany for Followers of the Transgressive One. And as I recall, this opened up our Sacred Contamination dinner at Beer Camp as well.
Yeah.
So this is how I'd like to close out the episode. Billy and Paul are going to take turns reading from the one section, which is where you would have someone leading the congregation saying it. And then normally we would have the entire congregation respond. I am not going to tempt fate by trying to have us all speak at the same time across the internet. So I will read the many line, and I will see if I can link to this in the show notes as well, so that if any of you listening would like to say it along with me when I do the many part, that way we can kind of connect despite being across time and space there. So whenever you two are ready, feel free to get started.
I'll go ahead and get started. I want to say that this litany was written by our friend Dwight Friesen, who is just a brilliant theologian and scholar. And
Awesome.
Just a beautiful pastoral heart. When the time came for mystery to be known, Creator became creation, revealing God as with. Emmanuel, God is with us.
The living word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood.
If you have seen me, you have seen the one who sent me, said Jesus of Nazareth.
So who is Jesus? And what does Jesus do?
Because Jesus is God, the incarnate one does not consider equality with God something to grasp or cling to, but surrenders divinity in order to discover a way of symbolic love with you, me, and all of creation.
If Christ is willing to give up godness in pursuit of loving relationship, what might that invite of us? Of me?
Jesus the Christ dined with the wrong people embraced the unclean, flipped the tables of the powerful, welcomed the children, forgave his murderers, and called us friends.
Is this what Shalomic life looks like? Could it be that the kingdom of God welcomes all and everything? Could it be that Jesus' new commandment to love one another as Jesus has loved us fulfills all prior commandments?
For God did not send Christ into the world to condemn the world, but to reconcile all and everything through Emmanuel.
Teach us, O God, to welcome the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, guiding us to live justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the God who is with. Cheers.
Cheers.
Paul and Billie Hoard, thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you for this wonderful book. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope to see you guys again soon.
So grateful for having us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a real joy.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.